Hello, welcome back to How to Read a Poem. Now today we're going to do a poem about a medical condition, Alzheimer's. The question to ask ourselves is this: how much do we understand about another person's medical condition? How does a very debilitating medical condition like Alzheimer's disease affect the people around the sufferer? And maybe the bigger question, how does a poem about Alzheimer, in other words, a poetic language, give us a different perspective about the disease, the condition that maybe a medical textbook can't? So let me just set this up. Alzheimer's disease is a common neurological disease characterized by a gradual and tragic loss in language, in memory, and the ability to understand the sufferer and understand the people around the sufferer. It's by the poet Bob Hicok, and it begins: chairs move by themselves and books. So the language of the poem immediately draws us into the condition of the sufferer of Alzheimer's disease in terms of a certain sort of unawareness about the basic facets of life, how chairs move by themselves and books. So someone must be doing the moving, but from the sufferer's point of view, that person is blotted out. She can't recognize who moves the chairs, who moves the books. So there's a certain sort of gap that's being presented here in terms of how the sufferer perceives the world and the slow debilitation of her mind. Grandchildren visit, stand new and nameless, their faces puzzles, missing pieces. This idea of a gap continues with the mention of the word puzzles. So even those people who are close to the sufferer, grandchildren, they stand new because the sufferer cannot recognize who the grandchildren are. They stand nameless. So apart from the fact that their grip on reality is lessened, the basic facet of reality, language. After all, poetry is about language. So how do you write a poem about really the loss of language? So there are gaps in terms of the sufferer's cognition, her perception of the world, and her grip on language. So new and nameless. If, as the poet suggests, language is integral to a sense of identity, then with the loss of language comes the loss of identity and the ability to think in terms of language. So their faces puzzles, missing pieces. The poet uses a simile next. She's like a fish in deep ocean, its body made of light. A very interesting simile, but one that further continues this idea of the sufferer, the grandmother, being lost like a fish in deep ocean, floundering, it might suggest, its body made of light. There's something dematerialized about the sufferer, which continues in the next line. She floats through rooms through my eyes. So the loss of memory, the loss of language gives the grandmother a certain sort of weightlessness. She's dematerialized to the extent that she's almost wave-like, or she's almost like a ghost that floats through rooms through my eyes. So that grip on reality is being lessened because language slowly slips away from the sufferer, because memory slowly slips away from the sufferer. So here, the poem wants us to imagine life from the perspective of the person suffering from the debilitating condition of Alzheimer's, in terms of a loss, in terms of life becoming paradoxically filled by gaps that somehow distance the speaker away from reality, that makes the speaker not fully human, almost as if like a ghost drifting through rooms. An old woman bereft of chronicle the parable of her life. It is interesting here that the poem uses words like chronicle and parable, because if you think about it, what is a chronicle? A chronicle is a story. And we often say a story, in other words, narratives are ways in which people make sense of their lives. So if language constitutes narrative's basic building blocks, therefore the implication is this woman has no sense of a past and therefore no sense of a present. So a woman bereft, a woman that has lost her chronicle, why she's here, how she relates to other people, how she looks at her past, and how she relates her past to her present. So narrative vanishes, the chronicle vanishes. the parable of her life. We often think of parables as biblical stories in which the story conveys a certain sort of spiritual message, a certain sort of spiritual meaning. We might think of old people as repositories, bearers of wisdom. So the poem ironicizes this idea of the old being the person full of wisdom, the old being the person full of spiritual knowledge, when even that parable of her life slips away from her. So it's not only the loss of the past, but that total loss of meaning, a loss of a meaningful context with which she relates, not only to her life, but to the lives of the people around her. So that idea of gaps, that idea of blanks, these things are portrayed in the poem and they are continued on in the lines. So the poem has an end stop line here. Her life, full stop. Why is this important? Let's read on. And though she's almost a child, so now the perspective shifts onto a third person point of view. So now we kind of understand the speaker is someone related to the sufferer. And though she's almost a child, there's still blood between us, blood relations. So the poem kind of probes not only the condition of the sufferer, but also the effects that the sufferer has upon her caretaker. We might say her son. And though she's almost a child, so that old person almost degenerating to a certain sort of naivety that a child possesses, there's still blood between us. The speaker has a duty. The speaker says he has an obligation to care for his mother. I passed through her to arrive. So the kinship ties and how it's founded upon deep biological bonds between the mother and the son. So I protect her from knives, stares. So that ethic of protection, that ethic of care that the speaker shows to the sufferer, from the streets that call as rivers do. So that interesting metaphor linking the streets to rivers, but in a particular way. In a particular way that suggests the streets are as dangerous as rivers. Once the person enters a river, that person faces the possibility of drowning, of getting killed. So the real basic way in which the speaker has to protect his mother, not only from knives, household implements, but also daily activities like crossing the road, that becomes as difficult as navigating a torrential river. So that idea that the speaker has to protect the mother from such daily activities, which now seem all the more difficult for the sufferer. A summons to walk away, to follow. And dresser demonstrate how buttons work when she sometimes looks up and says my name. So that daily mundane routine of dressing the mother, of showing her how buttons work. So the sufferer has fully lost the ability to care for herself. And that's where that ethic of care, that's where the ethic of filial piety comes into play. So in terms of daily activities, the speaker has to help out. The speaker has to sort of guide the mother once again to understand the world around her. But the poem doesn't end on a particularly sad note, because something happens here. So in the course of the daily activity, something remarkable happens when she sometimes looks up and says my name. If the first half of the poem was all about this gradual loss of language, this deterioration of the sufferer's mental and spiritual faculties, suddenly out of the blue, almost a kind of epiphanic moment, the name of the speaker is said. She remembers. There is a sudden filling in of the gap that has been assumed to be forever lost. And she says my name, the sound arriving like the thrill of a bird, so rare it's rumored no longer to exist. So think about that. From the caretaker's point of view, from the son's point of view, the fact that the mother can remember his name is almost as precious, it's almost as exotic as the trill of a bird. Note, it's not the sound of a bird, it's not the chirping of the bird, it's the trill of a bird. So that word trill suggests something exotic, something alien, something foreign, something that's almost miraculous to discover. So words like that tell us about the impact of that one moment, that remembering of the son's name. So it arrives and the speaker responds to it, we might say, almost in a mood of ecstasy, almost in a mood of joyful recognition that the mother is able to say the son's name, and it arrives like the thrill of a bird, so rare it's rumored no longer to exist. So something that happens out of the blue, something completely unexpected, something that's almost come from the dead, we might say. So the poem has allowed us to think a bit more closely about the condition of Alzheimer's. Now I'd like to answer my question that I've posed at the start. How does poetic language provide a certain sort of perspective that we can't find anywhere else? Now, nobody would seriously suggest that this poem be put in a medical textbook to study the classic symptoms of Alzheimer's. We have medical textbooks for that. We have scientific language for that. We have statistics telling us how many percent of the population suffer from Alzheimer's. We have medical treatments to address the condition. But where does poetic language come in? I think in a poem like this, by putting the painful subject of Alzheimer's, poetic language allows us to relate more deeply on a more emotional level. Language brings us into the world, not only of the sufferer, but also of the caretaker. These sorts of people who are deeply affected and deeply changed by the medical condition known as Alzheimer's. So it might therefore give us a greater sense of empathy towards people who are suffering, towards people who have to deal with the onset of such a disease. Because poetic language allows us to enter into the world of the speaker here, into the world of the sufferer. We might say poetic language about Alzheimer's gives the sufferer of Alzheimer language in order for the reader to conceptualize, and not only that, to empathize, to be moved by the suffering of somebody whose grip on language has slowly been lost. And that, I think, is how poetry intervenes. That, I think, is how poetry gives us a new way to think about all these issues that will affect a good many of us in the future. This has been How to Read a Poem. Thank you.